The role of violence during the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement, mainly happening in the 1950s and 1960s, it aimed to secure social justice for African Americans, and they wanted to ensure their equal rights under the law in the U.S. Although the Civil War abolished slavery, it did not stop discrimination against Black Americans. They continued to face racism, particularly in the South. By the mid-20th century, Black Americans initiated a fight for equality and injustice, marking an important two-decade-long campaign. The NAACP. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is one of the oldest and most significant civil rights organizations in the U.S. Founded in 1909 in response to a deadly race riot in Springfield, Illinois, it played a crucial role in the advancement of colored people, all while fighting against racial discrimination and injustice. Founding members included pivotal civil rights activists W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Mary White Ovington. Key accomplishments include landmark Supreme Court cases like Brown v. the Board of Education in 1954 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They continued to address issues such as police brutality, inequality, and discrimination in education. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a member of the NAACP. King's leadership and activism were crucial in advocating for the goals of the NAACP. King's collaboration with them was a pivotal point of his career. King became a prominent activist after he was the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. He became the spokesperson for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he played an important role in peaceful protests, marches, and boycotts. King had many impactful speeches, including his famous I Have a Dream speech given during the March on Washington in 1963. Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old Black boy from Chicago. He was brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955 after allegedly whistling at a white woman. His killers, Roy Brandt and J.W. Milham, abducted Till, beat him severely, and shot him before dumping his body in the Tallahatchie River. His killers were acquitted by an all-white jury, despite the obscene amount of evidence, which sparked national outrage and brought attention to the racial violence in the South. The Ku Klux Klan. The KKK is a white supremacist hate group that has a long and dark history of violence in the U.S. Founded in 1865 by Confederate veterans following the Civil War. Originally a secret society, the Klan wanted to enforce white supremacy in the South. They opposed desegregation, voting rights for African Americans, and other advances in civil rights. They engaged in bombings, assassinations, and other acts of violence to terrorize communities of color. Notable events include the Birmingham church bombing, Freedom Summer murders, and the assassination of Medgar Evers. They are a symbol of hate and racism, and they use violence in pursuit of their racist beliefs. The Birmingham church bombing. In September of 1963, 4 young African-American girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, these girls were killed when members of the Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, ultimately trying to discourage any involvement in the civil rights movement. The bombing further galvanized support for the civil rights movement. They showcased the urgent need to confront racism and white supremacy in America. The bombers were not brought to justice until many years later, that highlights the failures of the criminal justice system to address racially motivated violence. The assassination of Medgar Evers. It happened in June of 1963, and it was a tragic death that shook the civil rights movement. Medgar Evers was a well-respected civil rights activist and leader of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was assassinated outside of his home in Jackson. Evers had been organizing boycotts and voter registration drives, and his murder showcased the risks faced by those advocating for racial equality in the deeply segregated South. His death sparked outrage and led to widespread protests. Despite the attempts to obstruct justice, including 2 mistrials, Evers' killer, Byron D. LaBeckwith, was finally convicted of murder in 1994, more than 30 years after the crime, with also highlighting the failures of the criminal justice system. The Freedom Summer Murders. In June of 1964, there were a series of tragic events following the civil rights movement in the United States. 3 civil rights activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were abducted and murdered by members of the KKK in Nabuscova County, Mississippi. These activists were working to register black votes. Their bodies were later found buried in an earthen dam. The brutal murders furthermore outraged the public over the violence faced by civil rights activists in the South. The outrage helped gain support for the civil rights movement. Bloody Sunday. During the first Selma to Montgomery March in 1965 for voting rights, peaceful protesters were brutally attacked by Alabama state troopers as they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Without warning, the officers attacked the nonviolent protesters, beating them and dispersing the crowd, resulting in numerous injuries. The violent crackdown was captured on television and broadcasted nationwide. This shocked the nation and helped gain support for the civil rights movement. How the violence changed public opinion. The brutal acts of violence, such as the Birmingham church bombing and Bloody Sunday, received extensive media coverage nationally. Images of innocent children killed in bombings or peaceful protesters being beaten by law enforcement shocked the nation. Graphic nature of these events forced many Americans to confront the harsh realities of racial discrimination and racial violence. Victims of violence were portrayed not as agitators, but as ordinary Americans fighting for their rights. Stories of individuals like Emmett Till or the young girls killed in the Birmingham church bombing changed the public's opinions. Violence against Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement changed public opinion about segregation and exposing the brutality and injustice of the system, leading to legislative and social changes that ultimately help stop segregation and advance racial equality in the U.S. Conclusion. The civil rights movement aimed to secure civil justice for Black Americans and ensure their equal rights, which was led by organizations like the NAACP and prominent figures like Martin Luther King Jr. The movement challenged segregation and discrimination through legal advocacy and nonviolent protests. Tragic events such as the Birmingham church bombing, Bloody Sunday, Freedom Summer murders, and the assassination of Medgar Evers shocked the nation and gathered support for civil rights. Violence against Black Americans exposed the brutality of segregation, shifting public opinion and leading to legislative and social changes that helped advance the fight for racial equality. And these are my references.